Good evening, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the summer so far. Today was beautiful out, a little breezy and cool, but not too bad. Um, it's been a really nice week. So so far, all this rain passed by, and as usual, it passed to the south of us. So I've spent a lot of time watering my gardens. But it's enjoyable to get out and hear the birds and to be outside. We're going to take a break from what we were doing before uh, about the perspective of living in love. And I have a new topic to start tonight. Um, but it's going to link together uh, with all the things I've been talking about in the past year or so. So tonight I want to talk about the purpose of the ecclesia. And the Greek word ecclesia, I hear people say ecclesia all the time, but according to Strong's and Thayer, it should be pronounced ecclesia. So just so you know, ecclesia. And I am going to say either ecclesia or ecclesia, depending on how my mind goes at the moment. But as an introduction for tonight, we find the word ecclesia frequently in the New Testament in the Greek. In most English translations, it is translated as church, or maybe in some I found was assembly. So, what is the purpose of the ecclesia? And if you use some things like the Concordant or Jonathan Mitchell or even Kenneth Woost and some others, they use it as the word community or called out community of people that are called out from something. And we say, well, we're called out from the world. And, in my mind, I think the direction I'm going in is we are really called out. And I don't think that we see ourselves as called out. We see ourselves as called out in some ways, but we're still attached in other ways. And, it would be hard. I've learned, and I'm reading a book by a young man. Well, he might be closer to my age by now, but he really went called out, and he has a community. He has a house in a city, and his house is a place where people can come and gather. They have food. They offer shelter for homeless folks. They do all kinds of things in the community, and that's all he does. There's other people that do that also, but his goes beyond a homeless shelter. He's trying to model what he does exactly what we see in the New Testament that a church is. That what Paul, I believe, had in mind and what Jesus had in mind. We look at the church in early Acts. This isn't part of my notes, but we look at the church in the early Acts period, and we see all the things they did. And I think sometimes we say, well, that was just for their time, or for a short time between the ages, or whatever. But I think when we read about what Paul is saying and the things he says about churches, which we'll get into in the next couple of weeks, it's pretty close to that. And that's what this young man tried to do. And I'm not proposing that we do that. We have jobs, we work, we do things in life. And there's also nothing wrong with that, because in Paul's time, people also had jobs and worked. Paul worked when he needed to earn money. That way he didn't have to be a burden on other people in the church. But even with that, there's still more behind this, I think. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. So the community, I believe the community is the purpose of what the ecclesia is. Some people might say, well, what's the purpose of church? We say, well, we go to church to learn about God. We would go to church to do Bible studies. We go to church to have prayer meetings. We go to church to do other things that we might do for communities, like raising money, getting the book bags together, doing things like that. And we think that those are things that we do in church. It's to live for God or Jesus, or even for each other. Maybe where we go to make sure that we keep the commandments throughout the week, or you might say it's to win souls. All of these things we might say about church, but I think when we use the word church, it narrows it down to it's a building, it's a place I go once a week. This is what I do. Uh, and then I'm done. And then the rest of the week, I live life as normal. But the community, the ecclesia, is supposed to be far more than that. And, the word community, I didn't look it up in the dictionary. I had meant to, but when you think of community, there's purposes behind a community. And even within a community, there might be categories and subcategories and subclasses and all those types of things, depending on how it's arranged. But a community has a political sense to it. It's not political as in government political, but it has a political sense of this is something to which we belong. And it's run in certain ways, and we meet in certain places. But when we're done meeting and we go out, we still belong to that community. And that is our community. It usually, communities usually fall into the jurisdictions of larger bodies. We don't usually call the larger body a community, but it is a community. We might use terms today as town, villages. I live in a hamlet. I live in the town of Clarendon, and the town of Clarendon is pretty sparsely populated. In my town, we don't have a village. We have a hamlet. We have 2 gas stations. One has grocery items in it. The other is like the old K&K. It's a Crosby's. And, that's it. That's what we have. And our big intersection is a 4-way stop at 237 and 31. So we have a hamlet. It's very small, but it's a small community. And we think of it as a community, as being part of the political body of the town. Unfortunately, in my town, it's not what you think of a small town. It's not. You might think it's not really a community, because in our town, even though it's small, since we've lived here, it's never seemed to be very close knit. There's not a lot that goes on here that you might see in other small towns. But that's just the case, it's fine. It's beautiful. I like living here. It's a hamlet. It's a community that I belong to. It's hard to imagine a community as being a state or province, because they're so big. Because we often imagine a community to be a place where we are close to our neighbors, or take part in community events like garage sales and kids soccer leagues, the local fire hall dances, or maybe there's an auction at the local town hall. I mean, there's things like that happen. When Danny was really young, the Holly, which is in the next town over, is a village, and the village of Holly is far more than it used to be. There's all kinds of stuff that goes on there. They're redoing all the buildings. I mean, it looks nice there. But they used to have kids soccer leagues, and we took Danny, and they had adult games where, every few weeks or so, the kids could watch all the adults play soccer, which was a lot of fun. Love playing soccer, but those are things in a community. So I think we don't imagine many times a community as being a political group. But I think it is. And I think that's what Paul was aiming for when he talked about the ecclesia, or churches or assemblies. They were not political bodies in reality that you would have found in the Empire of Rome. And very important to think and remember, Paul lived in, and all these people lived in, an empire that had its own rules and its own laws and its own ways. And so Paul's idea was that the communities of God would mirror, not exactly like the way Rome operated, but mirror in the sense that it was a political body in and of itself, and it would run parallel to these other bodies. It was they had house, church in your house, the community in your house. Paul rented a place once from someone so that he could have a meeting hall, and he was there for quite a while. He was in Corinth for a year and a half, and in that time, he met in synagogues, he met in people's houses. I mean, who knows? They might, he met in Athens. He went to Athens and spoke in the marketplace where the philosophers gathered. So wherever they could meet, they met. But they were so closely knit together that when they weren't together, we were still together. We were always part of that community, which ultimately is part of the Church of God, or the communities of God. So it would be an alternate society. Alternate because life under the empire and life under the world power at the time was not acceptable to the ways of God. It didn't meet the things that Jesus taught. It didn't mean the things that God or that Paul was taught by the Spirit. It didn't meet any of that. And we're going to see some of that in a minute here. And so because it didn't meet that, there needed to be an alternate political body, which was the community of God, or the Church of God. It's very important, and it'll fit somewhere along the line, of course, in what I'm developing, which I already talked about before. But it's very important to remember that they lived in a time and things went on around them completely different from what we do. So when we read the scriptures and we read the things that Paul wrote or that Jesus wrote, we have to keep in mind, as my dad said Sunday, the intent of the people that they're writing to, or the now I can't even think of the words. Whoever they're writing to, it mattered. And when we read the scriptures, we cannot read them and think, oh, well, this is like this in in the United States of America or in Europe. It wasn't written that way. It was written to people at a time, and to better understand the things that are being said. Audience relevance was what he said. So we have to remember who it's being written to. It doesn't mean that we can't take things from it, because we absolutely can take a lot from it. But sometimes things are said, as we'll see in a minute, and people go off the deep end about it because they don't understand why it was said. So overall, we're talking about community, and I think, again, church has become a place. It's a building. It's where we go, and I think the churches do things in the community, but I think something has been lost of what it's really supposed to be about. And so that's what we're going to get into. So let me pause, and we'll have a word of prayer, and then we'll continue. Lord, we are thankful for each other. We're thankful for your word. We're thankful for the work your son did. We're thankful that we can gather in so many different ways now and reach people. I think it's really neat that there's folks that are with us that used to live up here with us and be part of our immediate, I'll say, congregation, but they're still part of it now, which is it's just incredible. And I'd love to hear them and see their faces and even just see their names. And it's really neat. And we're very thankful for that. Lord, I pray that you would bless this tonight. And I pray that folks would take these things and think on them, read the scriptures, and see what they take out of it. I pray you bless that, Lord. Also for the folks that are in the process of healing or are sick, as my mom mentioned tonight, Gail's son, the Ricks, of an accident. Pray for our brother Ron, that things would go well with him. I know that they're looking for a place for him to get rehabbed, which is a huge step, and definitely something that you take encouragement from, that things are going in the right direction. And I pray for all those folks, and others who are also suffering from ailments or even emotional things that are going on. Miss Vicky, um, the wife of Ron, has got to be very stressful for her also, and for their kids, and for the Ricks and anybody around them, and for Gail and her son, and for others who have things going on too. We just pray for all of them, that they would have strength, and that they would rest in you, who is our ultimate hope. Amen. So let's continue on. So Paul had a lot more in mind, and we're going to start looking at what the Jewish church was. So I will have scriptures tonight, not as many as normal. So I hope you'll forgive me for that. I know we're used to having a lot of scriptures. But some of these things I'm talking about come from various people that I've read over the past couple of years. And if you ever want a list of things that I've been reading, I can gladly share it with you. Sometimes over the past year, I've said who things are coming from, and tonight there'll be some of that. But really, it's kind of a conglomeration of people I've come upon. And really, honestly, what these people have done for me is they haven't put thoughts in my head. They've kind of validated, some people would say, some things I've been thinking about in the scriptures, which is kind of neat when you find that. Sometimes when you're thinking in a certain direction, or you're thinking on a certain thing based out of the scriptures, and you can't find anything about it, or you find a bunch of people that say no, it could be disappointing. And sometimes you think, well, I'm just way off the mark, and I'm wrong. But sometimes we might not be completely wrong. Sometimes we really need to dig in and find out more. And there's a lot of people out there that can help us do that, which is really a blessing. We have so much more access to stuff like that than folks like Paul did, and people in the church, in the early church, which is really neat. But the Jewish system of synagogues and the temple were more than places of worship. They represented the Jewish political system. You could take that from what we talked about last week with the Zealots. I mean, they wanted to get rid of Rome. They couldn't possibly think they can get rid of Rome completely, but they thought that they could push Rome out of their circle or of their area, and then they could reestablish the kingdom of Israel. If you know anything about the Maccabean revolts, you can, just by reading that, you can see what's going on. And of course, if you have the Apocrypha, you can read all about the revolts in there, and Josephus writes about it, and other people. But these folks were hardcore Jewish system worshipers. They weren't just people that just popped up out of Israel and decided, hey, we want our own nation back. I mean, these were follow the law to the letter. That's what Paul was. And a couple guys in Jesus' group, Simon the Zealot, these guys were zealots. They were all in it for the Jewish religion. And it wasn't just religion, it was their political system that they had in Israel in the Old Testament. God's intent was that there would be a kingdom on the earth, but it wouldn't be what we think of as the kingdom. The kingdom was always supposed to be what it is now. It was just supposed to be manifested on the earth. And that's what God wanted to do through Israel. Obviously, they wanted human kings. They didn't want God as a king. We know all that. And they made decisions. But in their system, they made the kings were supposed to make decisions based on what the priest would tell them after the priest talked to God. They had the I hope I say it right, the Urim and the Thummim, I think it was, two stones that they kept behind behind their breastplate, and they would ask questions of God, and based on the stone they pulled out, or however it worked, they would. I talked about this a long time ago, and I'm sure John has also probably. But however whatever stone came out, it was the decision that God made, and then that would be the decision the king would made. They would go to war, they would make peace, they would do all these things based on God's instructions. And of course, that's not really what happened, but that's what was supposed to happen, and that's what was in the zealot's mind. It was all doomed to failure from the start, because from the start, you read the book of Judges, they constantly went out from God's way. I won't go into it, but it became a human system, and it became a system modeled after everything around the world and in the world around them. And by the way, in my thinking, that happened extremely early, much earlier than most people think. That system started, and they started pulling away from what God had intended very early on. But so Paul and Jesus both had things to say about the zealots, which was, don't be a zealot, don't be a revolutionary. And we talked about that a lot in a lot of detail last week. So God, because the reason is because God's kingdom is not about an earthly rule. There is no system on this earth ever that has succeeded completely outside of God. Or I shouldn't say outside of God, with God's blessings. I just don't believe there is. There's, I know some people will get really angry for saying this, but we sing songs like God Bless America and these types of things. God is blessing individuals that are part of his community. That's who God blesses. If a lot of those individuals get together and they do things in the community and make it great and good things happen, then that is of God, because they're being driven by God. There are no kingdoms or nations on this earth, none, apart from early Israel and what Israel was supposed to be. There are no others that are supposedly blessed by God. The reason our country is great, the reason our country is so free, is because the people that started it had a vision and they made it happen. And we make it happen. And the reason that our country is in the situation it is today, I don't believe it's because the country has gotten away from God. You could say that there are less godly people in it making good things happen. That sure is a possibility. But I don't think there are any nations today that were appointed by God to be some type of, this is what God's kingdom should be like. There just aren't. It doesn't matter what country it is. It's individuals as part of a community. And we're going to see that that's what Paul was really driving at. So the system of the Jews, we know, passed away. The hope of the Jewish state in any Jewish mind was highly misplaced. It just wasn't going to happen. Jesus was, we know, he was a prophet, priest, and king. He prophesied about what was going to happen to the Jewish state of mind. It just wasn't going to happen. And it certainly wasn't going to be him that made it happen. So when we go to what Paul's talking about in community, it's a new system altogether from what the Jewish system was. This system is not meant to try and infiltrate anybody or embody any type of world system. It's meant to be a system after God. And all the kingdoms of the world are what we would call the powers. If you think way back to when I did the thing from Eugene Peterson's book, Reverse Thunder, that's what it was about. It was about not just the powers in the heavens, which we did a big thing about, God's wars against the spiritual beings, and that mirrored what was going on with the kingdoms of the earth, because the kingdoms of the earth are fallible, and they just don't work. There's always something that they're doing that's way outside of what things should be. So Paul's community was God's community, and it remains that today. And for the purposes today, it's God's community. We're going to really talk a lot about what Paul said, because he really dived into this a lot. And so we're going to call it Paul's community. So the system, again, is meant to be parallel, never intersecting, never. Paul's and Jesus' idea of the community was never become part of the system to try to make something happen correctly, because it's not going to happen. The only way that the things that the people of God, the individuals that make up God's community, are in, when they're in line with God, it doesn't matter what's going on around them. It doesn't matter what kind of community. They could live in a hardcore communist country where they could be put in jail for their beliefs. It doesn't matter. They have a community, even if it's only a couple people, and that community strives to follow after what God wants. They don't become part of some revolutionary group to try to overthrow their communist government. It would be great for them if they didn't have to live in that, but that is not what God is striving for here. I know this sounds probably way off to a lot of you, but I think I think it's correct. I think it's correct thinking. It's what God is looking for from us to be. I mean, we even look at the word called out when we read, what Ecclesia means, or Ecclesia means. Called out of what? It's not just called out of drunkenness or called out of adultery, or called out of cursing in God's name, or women wearing short shorts and all this other stuff. It's called out of the world altogether, every part of it. So in Ephesians 5:24, we read, just as the church or the community is subject to Christ, also wives ought to be in everything to their husbands. In Jonathan Mitchell, it says, but just as the called out community or summoned forth assembly continuously, humbly aligns and places itself under for the Christ, the wives, thus also the wives to the husbands in everything. And it continues. So the point here I want to get out of these verses is the church is subject to Christ. It's the called out community, as Jonathan Mitchell says, to continuously humble itself and align itself and placing itself under the Christ. Now, Paul uses in these statements things about husbands and wives. And unfortunately, this can be taken, and I know this from being in different Facebook groups, and some people literally take this to mean, wives should be humble and quiet, and they shouldn't be doing anything. Men should do everything, and all these things. And I think that's unfortunate. There's the other side who think that Paul was demeaning to women. There's even a book that I got on Kindle, which I haven't read yet, which I should, because it's very short. It's called something like The Deal with Paul and Women. And it goes through how Paul wasn't thinking to be demeaning to women, and that he didn't mean the things that a lot of people take it for. He's using the relationship of a man and woman because they're to love each other devotedly. He's only using the woman as it is because it's a woman, and the church is often called she, or the bride of Christ, or something along those lines. So that's what his thinking is. And he's trying to model what the community of God should look like, and he's using that, and he even calls it a mystery or a secret. How this happens is incredible in his mind, that a man and woman get married and they stay married and they stay in a loving relationship. To Paul, that's just an incredible thing. And I'll tell you why that is in a minute, why it's such an incredible thing to him. But it's apart from a worldly system. That's what we're looking at. He says down in verses 32 to 33 of chapter 5, this is a great mystery, and I'm applying it to Christ and the church. Each of you, however, should love his wife as himself, and a wife should respect her husband. So right there, he's saying, I'm not saying that for any other reason than I'm trying to just give you a picture of what the church should be. We should be in loving relationships with each other as a community, just as a husband and wife are. And when we talk in the means of love, that is. And that's how the church should be with Christ and with God. That's the type of relationship. That's the closeness. If you read the book of Hosea, God even uses that as an example, right? He has Hosea go out and marry a prostitute and have children with her. And, you can read the story, and God is saying, that's what my relationship was like with you, but it should be like it is between a man and a woman uh, who love each other deeply. And we're not talking about romantic love, obviously. We're talking about deep love for one another. And so had intended to do this as kind of a side note, but it really fits right in because it's it talks about what the community was like that Paul lived in. And it's not just because some people in his neighborhood felt this way. This was the Roman Empire. And the Greeks before it, which their thought process and their ideas were very had infiltrated into the Roman Empire heavily. It was for the Romans, it was an accepted religion or accepted philosophical viewpoints to go alongside of their empire, because they did have those things that they accepted, as we talked about before. So other people take these passages and they twist them, and I think they take sick advantage over it, which is unfortunate. But Paul says these things because an alternative society was needed apart from the world they live in. And so I'm going to read to you now several paragraphs from Barclay's commentary. And if you have access to this or can find it, you really ought to read it, because he takes the whole idea of what Paul's talking about, and he gives you background and context in the culture that Paul lived and the reason that he had to say the things that he said. So I'm going to start, and this is from Barclay until I say stop. So it'll be kind of like a, the old SOS, whatever that was called. I can't even think what the name of it is now. It's how bad my memory is. You tap the thing, and then they do the telegrams, and they read it to the guy what to say, and then they say stop instead of period, so they know it's the end. So that's what I'm going to do. So right now we're going to start. Mr. Barclay says, at the time of Christ's coming, the marriage bond was in peril, even among the Jews. So much so that the very institution of marriage was threatened, since Jewish girls were refusing to marry because their position as wife was so uncertain. The situation was worse in the Greek world. Prostitution was an essential part of Greek life. Demosthenes had laid it down as an accepted rule of life. We have courtesans for the sake of pleasure. We have concubines for the sake of daily cohabitation. We have wives for the purpose of having children legitimately and of having a faithful guardian for all of our household affairs. The woman of the respectable classes in Greece led a completely secluded life. She took no part in public life. She never appeared in the streets alone. She never even appeared at meals or at social occasions. She had her own apartments, and none but her husband might enter into them. It was the aim that, as Xenophon had it, she might see as little as possible, hear as little as possible, and ask as little as possible. The Greek respectable woman was brought up in such a way that companionship and fellowship in marriage was impossible. Socrates said, "Is there anyone to whom you entrust more serious matters than to your wife? And is there anyone to whom you talk less?" Verus was the imperial colleague of the great Marcus Aurelius. He was blamed by his wife for associating with other women, and his answer was that she must remember that the name of wife was a title of dignity and not of pleasure. The Greek expected his wife to run his home, to care for his legitimate children, but he found his pleasure and companionship elsewhere. To make matters worse, there was no legal procedure of divorce in Greece. As someone has put it, divorce was by nothing else than caprice. The one security that the wife had was that her dowry must be returned. Home and family life were near to being extinct, and fidelity was completely non-existent. So that's the end of that part about Greece. So in Greek life, a woman was nothing. They were a tool. A woman who was a wife stayed at home. They didn't go out. They had children and they ran the household. That was it. That was their job. And they lived completely separate from the husband. The husband only went to visit the wife when they wanted to have children, or when he had to do something with his children, or ask about the affairs of his life. For any other romantic pleasure a man wanted, he went outside of the home. He went to prostitutes or he had concubines. That was it. That is how life worked in the great empire of Greece, which everybody says was so great and made so many advancements, which it did. Uh, but as far as a family life, it was obviously severely lacking. And unfortunately, young Jewish girls lived in this type of lifestyle, and it was even infiltrating into the Jewish mind. And so Jewish girls would not get married because they were so unsure of what their role would be, and they did not want to be uh, demeaned and delineated into just being a woman who stayed in the house all the time, had kids, and ran the home while their husband went out and saw prostitutes and had a good time going to meals and functions and parties, and they didn't do that. And so now we're going to read what Mr. Barclay says about the Roman Empire, and I'll tell you, it's no better. So I'm starting here with Mr. Barclay, where he says, in Rome, the matter was still worse. It was degeneracy. Its degeneracy was tragic. For the first 500 years of the Roman Republic, there had not been one single case of divorce. The first recorded divorce was that of Spurius Carvilius Ruga in 234 BC. But at the time of Paul, Roman family life was wrecked. Seneca writes that women were married to be divorced and divorced to be married. In Rome, the Romans did not commonly date their years by numbers. They called them by the names of the councils. Seneca says that women dated the years by the names of their husbands. Marital tells of a woman who had 10 husbands. Juvenal tells of one who had 8 husbands in 5 years. Jerome declares it to be true that in Rome, there was a woman who was married to her 23rd husband, and she herself was his 21st wife. We have a Roman emperor, Augustus, demanding that her husband we find a Roman emperor Augustus, that makes no sense, demanding that they must have a word mix up here on eSword, but it must be the wife of the emperor Augustus, demanding that her husband should divorce the lady Livia when she was with child, and that he might himself marry her. We find even Cicero in his old age putting away his wife Terentia that he might marry a young heiress whose trustee he was, that he might enter into her estate in order to pay his debts. This is not to say that there was no such thing as fidelity. Suentius tells us of a Roman lady called Melania who committed suicide rather than submit to the favors of Tiberius the emperor. But it is not too much to say that the whole atmosphere was adulterous. The marriage bond was on the way to complete breakdown. It is against this background that Paul writes. He wrote this lovely passage. He was not stating the view that every man held. He was calling men and women to a new purity and a new fellowship in the married life. It is impossible to exaggerate the cleansing effect that Christianity had on the home life in the ancient world and the benefits it brought to women. So that's the end of what Mr. Barclay has to say on that. Actually, there's more. It's a whole big section of pages. I invite you, if you can, to read it because it's really good. It's important to know these things when we read the things that Paul is saying. In his time, the things of marriage were not good. I mean, we could say in our time, marriage isn't good. People get divorced for nothing. People don't want to get married because they don't want to tie themselves into what a marriage is about. And people get divorced and remarried. It happens. I think that the ideas of concubines and prostitution running rampant is not what we have. It might be in certain parts of the country, and you could go downtown and find prostitutes on the street corner, but there are laws against it, and these women can get rounded up and put in jail. And people who go to the prostitutes can go to jail, and it can destroy their lives. That wasn't the case in Paul's day. These things were all accepted, and women were treated extremely low. And so when Paul says things like this, he's not meaning that women be treated low. He's trying to say that the woman is just like the man. You love each other. You treat each other with respect. You submit to each other. And this is what the church is supposed to be like with God, or the community. I think you read things like that. To me, Romans 1 takes on yet another new meaning. This was the way that the worldly power of Paul's time ran. This was the way of the Empire of Rome. It was the way of the Greek Empire. It was the way of Greek thought. This is the world that Paul lived in. This is the world that Jesus lived in. So when they say things about men and women, it's by no means to be taken the way that I won't even say a minority of Christianity. A lot of Christianity takes it way too far, beyond what it means. But this is just a snapshot of a kingdom that existed, and Paul is establishing a community that is going to be completely separate by it, political in every right on its own, to live on its own. But at the same time, in order to maintain peace and be able to live on its own and worship and manifest Christ in the way it should, it cannot support the current government, yet it cannot maliciously attack or do things against the current government. Because if it did, then it would lose everything that is love, because love includes loving your enemies, who Paul, I believe, saw the Roman Empire as an enemy. Jesus saw the Roman Empire as an enemy. However, they didn't see it as something to be conquered. They saw it as something that they would call people out of to live a completely different lifestyle, the way that God wanted. And those people would be a community of their own, away from the community, the political bodies that they lived in. As Jonathan Mitchell says, the called out community, it is continuously aligned with or under the Christ. So in Paul's day, as in our day, towns and governments meet to do things. The large governments, like the United States government, has congressmen and senators and the president and the judiciary system. They all meet and they all do things to run their system. And it's a worldly system. It is not to be desired. It is something to be lived in the opposite of, because even our system does things on a daily basis that completely go against the ways of God. We might be able to live very peaceably in our country because of the laws of our country, which is great and a blessing in of itself to us, that we be able to live the way we should live. But we are still to be that same type of close-knit community that Paul was talking about. And as we read in Corinthians, we're going to go into Corinthians chapters 8 to 14 and look at some things, because through there, Paul's talking to somebody that's supposed to be a community and they're not. And so it kind of gives us in some ways what the community should function as. And it includes, that we read in 1 Corinthians, even acting as a court to itself. If you have someone that's doing something wrong, like in the case of sleeping with one of his dad's concubines or something, or his dad's wife or whatever it might be, I can't remember, but he's doing something wrong in the family, in romantic type relations. And so, he has to be taken out of the community. Paul talks in earlier, and he says, why are you going to a public government court? Because you're going to the worldly system to solve things that you could solve within your own community. Obviously, if someone kills someone or breaks into someone's home and robs them of money and causes them harm, then, as Paul says, that's what the government's there for, to take care of people like that. But when you're just talking about everyday things, you need to act as your own judiciary, your own system, because you're supposed to be your own community. You're supposed to be showing the world this is how a community works together. And so in the community of God is not just meeting on Sunday mornings or Wednesday nights. It's supposed to be a lot more than that. It's a community of God all the time, and in every single way. It is subject to Christ at all times. Just a couple passages here. in First Thessalonians 1, Paul in his greeting uses church of the Thessalonians, which could be community of the Thessalonians. In Thessalonica, there might have only been a few because it's a city. But Woost uses the words assembly, and of course Jonathan Mitchell continues called out community. Also found in First Corinthians and Second Corinthians, he talks to the church of the Corinthians. Again, it's a large city, but it's a city, and so there's probably numerous small churches or communities within it, and they all do things and meet together and eat together. We know that because if we read the whole book of Corinthians, we know that they're eating together because there's problems with what they're eating. So they are meeting, they are doing these things, but they just need some push to get in the right direction. In Galatians, Paul in 1:13, Paul says, "You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism." That's what the NRSV says. In one, I can't remember, it says, "My way after the Jewish lifestyle." He says, "I was violently persecuting the church of God and trying to destroy it." So Paul says right there, the community of God, he was violently out to quash this community. So this community already existed in forms probably closer to the Greek and Judaism together, the Hellenism, from what Jesus did. But Paul also tries to overcome that. We see in many of his letters. If you read earlier in the greeting, he does call it the churches of Galatia, and we saw a while ago that Galatia is a huge area. So when he says the communities of Galatia, he's talking about people that are meeting and getting together over large portions of land, which take time. And they're probably writing back and forth each other, meeting each other for meals or parties or what have you. And I know they did those things too, because we now know, or I now know, it's been known in theological circles for a long time, that many of the things that Paul wrote in sections were actually from songs that the community sang together. In Ephesians, he calls them saints, instead of using the actual word, the community of Ephesus. And of course, it is commonly believed that Ephesians is probably not just written to Ephesus, because as many people will say, many theologians and scholars say that the words, Ephesus don't exist in the originals, but more likely it was a circular letter that went throughout Asia. And so he's calling them saints, which we know means people that are separate, sanctified. They're separate from the world. I thought possibly maybe Paul even uses that greeting because he's writing to people that already know they're part of a different community, where the other ones he has to say a reminder in the greeting, you are community of God. Which could be, but probably not. It's just something that popped in my mind as I was reading it. So, in verse 22 and throughout the book of Ephesians, he uses the word church or community of God. He says in chapter 1 of Ephesians 22 and 23, and he has put all things under his feet and has made him the head over all things for the church, the community of God. Christ is the head. Christ is the head. Christ is my head. Nobody else is my head. In my mind, in my thinking today, I live in a country that is no doubt probably one of the better countries you could live in the world. We'll leave it at that. That's where I live. But my thinking more and more and more is this country is not my head. Nobody in this country is my head. I live in it. I submit to it. I follow its laws so that I can live peaceably the way that Christ wants me to live. And I think that mindset to me has become very important. And I think it was important to Paul. So many things in my mind that I don't want to say, but I think it's just in the simple thing we're talking about, community, it's very important. The community is of God, and Christ is its head. And in Christ's body, that same fullness of God dwelled, according to Colossians 1:19 and 20. And it is we are part of that body. And I hope we all know that the Spirit of God dwells in us. We find that in Romans chapter 8. He dwells in us. Uh, we are part of his community. He experiences with us and we experience with him. And that's what he's looking for. And he's looking for that complete uh, devotion, or it's no secret that we're supposed to be utterly and completely devoted to our Lord and Savior and to our Father, to our spiritual family. He wanted us to be part of his large family, part of his kingdom, spiritually and physically. God is present for all to find. As we saw last week, we are to be subject to the local body, but in non-confrontational and not in violent responses. We just saw a huge violent response recently, where a bunch of people went up and got into the Capitol. And it's very unfortunate that would happen. I know some people, even maybe possibly some people listening to me now, say it was great. It was a violent response to something. And that is exactly what Jesus and Paul talked about not doing. So if a Christian is involved in something like that, they are definitely not acting in the way that the Ecclesia was called to be. So the same word subject is used under being subject to Christ as the head, but it's in a completely different sense than the subject to be living under the current system that you live in. And I think the difference can be quite easily discerned by just reading through the Old Testament or the New Testament completely, especially the book of Revelation, where we get into the powers and how people were to live, and they were martyred. People were martyred in early Christianity, martyred, and none of them stood up to make sure that nobody was martyred because they knew what they were living for. And that's just an amazing thing. The community of God is everything, and the world systems are nothing. And I'm going to close it out with Matthew 6:24. It says, "No one can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one or love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The NRSV uses the word wealth. Many translations keep with the word mammon, but it is known that the word mammon in the Greek is highly contested as to what it actually means. There's a man named Charles Thompson who has a Old Testament and New Testament translation, which I use frequently in study. He says, you cannot be in the community of God, serving God, and living with be worldly temperament, which means you cannot be part of this world, including its systems, and have the mind that God wants you to have. And so, the question goes, I think that Paul would ask is, and we're going to see that, who are you loyal to? Are you people to the Corinthians and to others? Are you loyal to God, or are you loyal to the empire? Are you loyal to Jesus Christ, the head, or are you loyal to the Greek philosophical way of thinking, which was part of the Greek Empire? How are you living? Who does your allegiance belong to? A very important question. And we'll explore this further in the coming weeks. And I will wrap it up.
There you go. Thank you, Dan. That's most excellent. If I might add something, just something simple that I got from Greg Boyd. He brings out that when God created Adam and Eve, he gave them authority over land and over all the animals. He didn't give them any authority over other human beings.
Nope.
And so you see with Cain and Abel, what happened? One took authority over the other. And that's what we have today, and men don't see what community is. They want a hierarchy structure. And even, in churches, that's how it is, or communities, that kind of stuff. And it's really too bad. that men have lost sight of what God's original purpose was. He was the one that was to be the head.
Yep.
And folks just don't see that, which is too bad. So I thank you there, Dan, for that. That's a good study. All
I have a
right.
question.
Yes, ma'am.
Dan 3,
Yes.
in reference to your message, the community and that, I wonder if that scripture would could be put in there. Therefore, come out from among them, be separate, saith the Lord. You know which one it is? I think it's in Corinthians.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm not sure.
And I'm not sure if that's I think Paul was using that scripture maybe from an Old Testament scripture. I don't, you're in this group now, you're a Christian, you shouldn't be associated with anybody in the world. And if that could be plugged into what you're talking about.
I don't think that it's you can't be associated with anybody in the world. You don't follow their system. You have to be associated with people in the world in order to manifest who Christ is. You're just not following their ways and living their ways. No, it doesn't mean break off associations. And the verse is 2 Corinthians 6:17. And it says, "Wherefore come out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and do not touch the unclean thing, and I will receive you." Yeah, so it's a living after a style or a way the world lives, and that's what we're supposed to come out from. We're supposed to come out from them in the sense that we don't live like them. Obviously we don't. Obviously,
in the world.
Obviously they weren't supposed to go to orgies and things like that, which happened in his time frequently. They weren't to go to things like that, not that type of association, but it didn't mean that you don't work alongside people or you don't talk to your neighbor and stuff like that. But you come out from among them in the manner that you live the way you're supposed to live.
Right, it's living in the world, but not of the world, that type of thing.
Yeah, you can't. And I think that's what Romans 13 is about. You can't not live in the world. I guess you could. You can, who was the guy? It was a show we used to watch when I was a kid. I was thinking about this a couple of weeks ago. A guy with a big burly beard and he had a bear. He lived in the mountains way away from everybody, and he had some contact with people. Every time he had contact, of course, there was problems. But you could do that. But if you do that, how are you manifesting? You can't. You can manifest to yourself. You could probably manifest to the birds and stuff that see you by the way you treat them. But the idea is to manifest to people. So you have to be around them.
All right. Anybody else got a statement or question?
Yes, thank you.
Can I just ask the name of the commentaries by Mr. Barclay?
What's that?
Could I just ask for the name of the commentaries you mentioned?
It's called the Daily Study Bible, I believe, or Daily Study. Hang on. I can look it up for you. Yeah, it's called Barclay's Daily Study Bible.
Thank you.
It's. I think he's got separate ones for each book, or some of them might combine, but.
Yeah, I have the whole New Testament almost, but William Barclay.
If you get eSword, which is a free thing, of course, I donate to them because I use it all the time. But if you have eSword, it's not without its faults for sure. But anything that's in the public, anything that's not copyrighted anymore, it's public. Or if someone says yes, you can use it, it's free, and you can download all kinds of versions of the Bible. I mean, hundreds of different commentaries, and his is one of them that's on there. And it's really neat because if you're looking at a certain verse in the Bible, you just click C for commentary, and it takes you straight to any reference of that verse in any commentary. It's pretty neat.
Thank you.
Barclay's my favorite writer.
Yeah, he's got a lot of good stuff. For sure.
He's a universalist too.
Dan, this is Carl.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I think that reference, it just popped into my mind, was Grizzly Adams.
Thank
That
you.
was the show.
Yeah,
I don't know why I remember that, but
Grizzly Adams. I'm gonna see if I can find that on Amazon and Netflix. I think he had a crow too, or a raven or something.
yeah, something like that.
Well, all right, folks. Thanks for being here. We thank Dan for his labors, and we'll catch you all again on Sunday morning. God bless you.